So why do individuals engage in corporate crime? This is from Module 2, Reading, Part 2. In Trusted Criminals, author writes that a wide variety of theories exist on the individual motivation for white-collar crime. Some blame poor parenting and low self-control for all crime, including white-collar crime. Some turn to a rational choice theory based on actions by criminals, on their perception of opportunity, and the likely cost of the action, balancing between those. In this line, routine activities theory focuses on crime events as consequences of the presence of motivated offenders, suitable victims or targets, and the absence of capable guardians or protectors of property. Control theory looks at the strong social bonds that may prevent illegal activity by some and their lack, meaning that others will engage in crime. Sutherland himself argued for what's called differential association theory, which saw criminal behavior as learned through contact with others with a law-violating orientation. Conflict theory argues the behavior of the powerless is more likely to be defined as criminal, meaning if you aren't favored by society, your acts will be defined as criminal. All of these no doubt have some truth. But what most such theories do is confine themselves to usually low-level white-collar crime, individual acts of fraud, check kiting and so on, and ignore more elite versions of corporate crime. This is where Weisberg and his other co-authors, they looked at the profile of individuals committing white-collar crime, often within corporate organizations. They find, first of all, that most white-collar criminals, corporate criminals, have often had multiple contacts with the criminal justice system. And what's important is they find that often conventional people in a different context will be led to violate the law. Significantly, most of those convicted of white-collar crime come from middle-class backgrounds, often unremarkable for any of the markers that we think of for traditional crime. Interestingly, most had some prior arrest, 1/3 with an arrest outside the criteria of white-collar crime. So some propensity seems to have been in place. But what's significant is most white-collar offenders are much older at the time of their first and last arrest. The average first arrest usually happens at age 35. So these are not delinquent youth who then go off and commit corporate crimes. They're usually ones who did some minor crime and then moved on to later arrest for a much more dramatic crime. The mean criminal career of a white-collar offender is often 14 years, meaning they may have done it over a course of multiple years once you measure it. But where there is a different focus is on what they call the low-frequency offenders, folks who usually do their acts often in a crisis in their professional lives, using positions of trust to bail themselves out, while others respond to a unique opportunity to make a lot of money in business that they never thought possible. Key point here, many offenders convicted of white-collar crimes are not that different from others in society. Opportunity takers and crisis responders have a progression into crime. As the book argues, for many criminals, the key to understanding involvement in crime is not found in their distant past or in the complexities of human development. Rather, it lies in the immediate context of the crimes that they commit. Schneider writes that you analyze what rottens the barrel rather than just looking for the rotten apples. At Barings, as we've mentioned, there were poor controls and a fancy matrix management system that left little supervision and allow the massive risk to happen that sunk the company. Fraud at the massive international BCCI bank, facilitated by non-transparent annual audits with poor oversight by Price Waterhouse and other blue chip firms. At Parmalat in Italy, the chief executive used the availability of offshore holding companies and falsified documents to facilitate fraud with no controls really in place to stop it. And at Enron, the losses were hidden in new special purpose vehicles offshore and in ways that created a whole massive set of off-balance sheet transactions. And so while there's fraud, there's lots of new tools, both from auditing and so on, and how the economy is structured, how the banking system is operated, that allows these sort of innovations in criminality. So one thing to look at is the key similarities in the massive corporate crime operations we might study. In almost any widespread corporate criminality, the form of the corporation was usually an enabling factor. Often interlocking firms, interlocking ownership, a form of corporate complexity would often hide crimes from both prosecutors and internal audits. Often involved professionals within the firm that aided and hid the crimes. Almost across the board, some form of lack of transparency helped make it all happen. And more broadly, often in a context of political, economic, and cultural capital granted usually to rich white men within the firm that facilitated these ongoing ripoffs. So it's hard to blame any one bad apple, except maybe with Barings. All required large-scale collective cooperation for the massive frauds we usually saw. This comes under what's sometimes called the corporate habitus. This comes from a term from the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. The idea is you look at the structural realities of the for-profit corporation, the relations of power that they generate, how they shape individuals and the collective environment, what's often called the habitus. This is the mentalities and sensibilities, the practices, the techniques that characterize internal and external regulation of the firm. These, in turn, create assumptions and shape the regulatory field, reflecting and revealing enduring and structurally based relations of power. The key here is most corporate crime is not seen as criminal, immoral, or shameful by the dominant actors. Corporate lawyers are hired to stretch the law to increase profits. Enron showed a culture of defiance of those who might challenge its practices. And within these firms, those seen as beating the rules are rewarded with bonuses, promotions, respect, not criticized. And when government agencies do take action, businesses often reacted in these firms, not by questioning their own behavior, but by challenging the legitimacy of the agency, questioning them. And many corporate crimes are seen as, quote, illegal, technically, but not criminal in the minds of the corporate participants. And they definitely try to spread that belief out in the broader public, often with paid pundits parroting that line. You see this actually in Silicon Valley today with the slogan of, quote, move fast and break things. At the minimum, seeing pesky regulations as just something to blow through as outmoded compared to the innovations they're bringing. No need to stop to change the law before acting. This is the slogan that they promote, and it's part of the mentality you see more broadly. So the question becomes, who ends up institutionally resisting corporate crime and firms moving towards this kind of deviancy? There are institutional investor groups, pension funds, other large players that pressure management, elect new boards, work with regulators when they think the firm may be going off the rails. Financial journalism. Unfortunately, mostly fawning coverage, but there are some real investigations that come through the financial press. There are new uses of electronic technology to discipline players, tracking trades that might be suspicious, and when there is litigation, using email in legal discovery to track bad practices. And there is corporate ethics inside, where people do try to keep track and sometimes under pressure put in ethics officers, but hard to study the effect in practice, and so much of that's internal. So you do have, broadly, this issue of all of these institutions, all of this corporate habitus, either working for the firms that aren't committing the crimes, or on a spectrum of some illegal activity to the complete breakdowns we've seen in system failure, where the individuals are very much part of the incentives and values that motivate them on whether they're going to end up breaking the law or not.